Tonight, we follow the life of a player who never seemed to move like the others, and yet always arrived exactly where he needed to be. There is a kind of footballer who makes you look twice, not because he is doing something spectacular, not because he has just beaten 3 men with a burst of acceleration or struck a ball with extraordinary force, but because something about the way he moves does not quite match what you expect to see. The timing is slightly different. The rhythm is unusual. The body occupies space in a way that feels almost architectural rather than athletic. Nwankwo Kanu was that kind of player, a man who appeared, at almost any given moment, to be moving more slowly than the situation required, and yet who arrived at every necessary destination at exactly the right time. There is a question embedded in that contradiction that does not resolve itself easily. Why did he always look different? The answer, if it exists at all, lives somewhere inside a story that begins far from any European stadium, in a Nigerian city that is itself not particularly famous, and moves through experiences that would have ended most careers before they properly began. Let the question stay with you as the story starts. He was born on the 1st of August, 1976, in Owerri, the capital of Imo State, in southeastern Nigeria. Owerri is a city of moderate size, known within Nigeria for its markets, its food, its social energy. It is not Lagos, which carries the weight of being the country's largest city. It is not Abuja, which carries the weight of political centrality. Owerri is a place with its own particular character, and it is the kind of place where football is played in the streets and on patches of open ground with an intensity that does not require formal infrastructure. The young Kanu was tall from early on, unusually tall for his age, and also unusually slender, built in a way that did not immediately suggest athleticism in the conventional sense. The conventional sense, in Nigerian football as in most footballing cultures, associated physical quality with speed and power. A big, strong frame was a running back or a centre-back. Pace was the thing that opened doors. Kanu did not obviously possess either of these qualities in the way that scouts were trained to recognize and measure. What he possessed was harder to quantify, a relationship with the ball that seemed to reduce the distance between intention and execution, a spatial awareness that allowed him to understand where he was in relation to everything else, on a pitch with an accuracy that his height seemed counterintuitively to enhance rather than obstruct. He played street football in the way that Nigerian boys of his generation played it, with improvisation as the primary language and space as the primary currency. Street football teaches certain things that structured training cannot easily replicate. It teaches improvisation under physical pressure, since the surfaces are uneven and the rules are fluid. It teaches the value of close control, since the ball is more easily lost on concrete or compressed earth than on grass. And it teaches a kind of positional creativity, since there are no coaches to tell you where to stand, only the game itself making clear what works and what does not. There is something worth pausing on here, in the image of a very tall, very young boy navigating the compressed, quick decision environment of street football. The game on open ground does not accommodate hesitation. You learn to think faster than you move, or the ball is gone and the moment has passed. For Kanu, this environment was where the fundamental pattern of his game was established, not in a coaching session with cones and drills, and an adult explaining the correct way to receive a pass, but in the lived and repeated experience of finding solutions before they became obvious to anyone else. The street does not give you time to think after the fact. It teaches you to think before. His talent was recognized early enough for him to enter organized Nigerian football as a teenager. He joined Iwanyanwu Nationale, a club based in Owerri that has competed at various levels of Nigerian football over its history. This was his introduction to the structured game, to the rhythms of training, to the experience of being assessed and developed by people who understood football as a professional discipline rather than as a recreational pursuit. He was still a teenager, still learning what his body could do and how his understanding of the game could be expressed through it. What the people at Iwanyanwu saw was something unusual. The frame was still the frame, tall and lean and slightly awkward in the way that very tall teenagers are often awkward before the body and the mind come fully into alignment. But the touch was remarkable. The ability to receive the ball, to control it instantly and completely, to make the next decision before the pressure of opponents arrived, was exceptional. It was the touch of someone whose relationship with the ball was not effortful but easy, not learned but felt. Word of this talent moved, as such things move in African football, when the infrastructure is in place to receive them. European clubs were increasingly looking to Africa for players whose ability had been developed outside the expensive academies and youth systems of the top European leagues. On, a player of Kanu's quality, identified at the right moment, was the kind of discovery that clubs were actively seeking. Ajax found him, or more precisely, Ajax identified him and pursued the connection that brought him to Amsterdam. Ajax at that time was not simply a Dutch football club. It was one of the most significant footballing institutions in the world, and specifically one of the most significant in terms of youth development and the transmission of a particular football philosophy. The Ajax system, built on ideas that Johan Cruyff had helped to make famous, and that the club's coaches had developed into a comprehensive methodology, was one of the most structured and intentional approaches to developing young footballers that existed anywhere. He arrived at Ajax in the early 1990s as a teenager, entering an environment that was simultaneously very demanding and very clear. The demands were technical and tactical. Ajax wanted players who could understand the game at a level of sophistication that went beyond simply doing their own job. The positional awareness, the understanding of space, the ability to read the collective shape of a team and adapt to it in real time, these were the things that the Ajax system cultivated above everything else. For a player whose primary gift was exactly this kind of spatial and temporal intelligence, the environment was a natural fit, even if everything else about it was radically unfamiliar. He was a young man from Owerri, learning to live in Amsterdam, learning Dutch, adapting to a culture that was different in almost every respect from the one he had grown up in. These transitions are rarely discussed in the accounts of footballers' careers, but they are real, and they take time. The social adjustment, the language, the food, the climate, the distance from family, all of these create a background noise of difficulty that players manage alongside the primary task of performing at a high enough level to justify their presence at a club with significant expectations. Amsterdam in the early 1990s was a city with a very particular character. For a teenager arriving from Nigeria, the light alone was different, lower and softer in winter, unexpectedly long and pale in summer. Oh, the canals and the narrow streets and the particular density of a city, built on water, created an atmosphere that had almost nothing in common with Owerri's open spaces and social warmth. There was beauty in it, but it was a different kind of beauty, colder in register, requiring more time to feel familiar. Training grounds do not translate cultures. The hours after training, the evenings and the weekends and the small moments of daily life that accumulate into something like belonging, those take much longer. He navigated this with a quietness that seemed to be characteristic. He was not someone who made the process of adaptation visible. He did not seek attention for the difficulty, did not allow the displacement to become a story in itself. He simply continued. He trained. He learned the system. He improved. And very gradually, the shape of the player he was becoming started to become legible within the Ajax framework. The Ajax training environment of that era had a particular quality that players who passed through it described in consistent terms. The emphasis was on thinking, not on running, not on physical conditioning as the primary outcome of a session, but on decision-making, on positional understanding, on the game as a problem to be solved collectively rather than individually. For Kanu, whose mind had always operated ahead of his body's most obvious physical qualities, this was an environment that rewarded exactly what he already did naturally. The system saw in him what the street had already taught him, that the first and most important step in any football situation was to understand it clearly. What this produced, over months and then years, was not the sudden emergence of a dominant talent who took the training ground by storm. It was something quieter and more durable. A player whose understanding of the Ajax system grew deep enough that his contributions within it became reliable in a specific and valued way. He was not always the most visible. He was not always the player that a casual observer would identify as the most important. But within the logic of the team, his presence served functions that became clearer the longer he was there. What he produced at Ajax was not the story of a talent immediately dominating its environment. It was slower than that, more gradual. He played. He developed. He became part of a squad that was itself developing into one of the most remarkable club teams of its era. Ajax in the mid-1990s were building toward a Champions League campaign that would place them at the summit of European football. And the players who formed that squad included individuals of extraordinary quality: Patrick Kluivert, Clarence Seedorf, Mark Overmars, Edgar Davids. These were players who would spend the following decade at the highest levels of the European game, and Kanu was among them, learning within this environment, contributing from within it. The 1994-95 Champions League campaign brought Ajax to the final in Vienna, where they played AC Milan. Kanu was part of this squad, not a peripheral figure, but a genuine contributor to a team that was playing football of a quality that the competition had rarely seen. The final itself was won by Ajax, a significant moment in European football history, and a moment in which he played his part. He was 19 years old. He had arrived in Amsterdam only a few years earlier, from a city that most European football observers had never thought about, and now he had won the most important club competition in the world. This is the kind of biographical fact that tends to get processed quickly, absorbed into the broader narrative of a career, and moved past in favor of the next event. But it is worth allowing it to remain visible for a moment. A teenager from Owerri, with a body that no European scout's template would have identified as ideal, playing in a system of exceptional tactical sophistication, contributing to a Champions League victory. The combination of those elements contains something that resists easy summary. The Ernst Happel Stadion in Vienna on that evening held a crowd whose attention was fixed on a match that both sets of supporters understood to be significant. Milan were not a faded version of their former greatness. They were still a serious club with serious players, and the game was tight in the way that finals between serious sides tend to be tight. The goal that won it came from Patrick Kluivert. Young as Kanu was young, and the moment of its arrival produced the particular release of tension that only a goal in a final can produce. In the dressing room afterward, surrounded by teammates who had spent the season building to this point, Kanu was 19 years old and a European champion. Oh, what does a 19-year-old do with that? What does it feel like to have reached a summit before you have fully understood what you climbed? There is no clean answer to this. What is true is that the career did not stop there. did not plateau into the comfortable continuation of someone who has already achieved the highest thing. It continued, and what came next was nothing like what had come before. Then, in the space opened by that success, something happened that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with the continuation of a life. During a medical examination, a problem was found with his heart. The specific diagnosis was a significant structural issue, an aortic valve defect that had been present without detection throughout his developing career. The heart condition was serious, not a minor matter to be managed with medication and regular monitoring, but a genuine threat, a defect that meant his heart was not functioning as it should, and that, without intervention, could be life-threatening. The information, when it arrived in the way that serious medical information arrives, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a quiet and comprehensive rearrangement of everything. His career, which had just reached a peak with the Champions League victory, was suddenly uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with form or tactics or competition. It was uncertain because his body, the instrument through which everything he was able to do was expressed, might not allow him to continue. Think about what the weeks before that information arrived would have looked like. A young man who had just won the Champions League, training sessions resuming after celebration, the ordinary rhythms of professional football beginning again, and somewhere inside his chest, something that had always been there, that had been present through every street game in Awari, through every Ajax training session, through the final in Vienna, working silently and incorrectly. The body carrying its secret, the career proceeding without knowledge of what it was proceeding upon. The moment of discovery has a particular quality in retrospect. The examination that revealed the defect was routine, in the sense that such examinations are scheduled and standard for professional athletes. There was no dramatic symptom that prompted it, no collapse on the training pitch, no moment of visible crisis. There was a test, and then the results of the test, and then the conversation with medical staff in which the results were explained. And in that conversation, everything changed. He required surgery, serious cardiac surgery, performed to repair the valve and allow his heart to function safely under the physical demands of professional football. The surgery itself was the necessary step, but surgery of that kind carries its own uncertainties. Recovery takes time. The body after major cardiac intervention is different from the body before it, not necessarily diminished, but changed. The athlete returning from this kind of procedure has to learn, to some extent, what his body is now capable of, and what has become uncertain. He was out of football for an extended period. Months of recovery, of rehabilitation, of the slow process of returning cardiovascular fitness to a level that professional football requires. During this time, the career that had been building with such momentum was paused, and no one, including the people closest to him, could say with confidence when or whether it would resume. This is the part of the story that deserves to sit quietly for a moment before moving forward. He was 20 years old. He had won the Champions League. He had been identified as a talent of genuine significance. And now he was recovering from heart surgery, uncertain whether his body would allow him to continue. The psychological dimension of this experience is not easily described because it involves a kind of uncertainty that most people never face with quite this configuration of stakes. Not just uncertainty about a career, but uncertainty about the physical safety of pursuing it. The question was not only whether he would play again, but whether it was safe for him to do so. The rehabilitation period is one of the least documented parts of his story, and perhaps that is appropriate. What happens during recovery from serious surgery is largely internal, largely invisible to anyone outside the immediate circle of medical staff and family. There are the physical measurements, the gradual return of capacity, the tests that confirm the heart is responding as it should. And there is everything else, the hours in which the body is resting and the mind is not, the particular quality of uncertainty that belongs to someone who has been told they must wait before they can know. He would have understood, at some level, that the career he was recovering toward might be different from the career he had been living before. Not necessarily diminished in quality, but changed in relationship. The body was now a known quantity in a different sense. It had a history that it had not had before, a point of intervention, a repair. Whether this knowledge added caution to his playing style, or simply deepened an economy that was already present, is impossible to say with certainty. What can be said is that the player who returned was the same player who had left, and also, in ways that were perhaps only perceptible to himself, not quite identical. He played again. The surgery was successful in the sense that it corrected the structural problem sufficiently for him to return to professional football with medical clearance. The recovery was genuine. The career resumed. But it resumed with a difference, not in his ability, which remained exceptional, but in his situation. He was now a player who had experienced the possibility that the career might end, not through loss of form or injury in the conventional sense, but through the fundamental fragility of the body that made it possible. Whether this changed his relationship with the game is something that can only be speculated about. He was not someone who expressed this kind of inner experience through public statements. He was, in that as in most things, private and contained. His move to Inter Milan followed the recovery period. Inter were one of the great European clubs, and the transfer was a significant step in the conventional progression of a career from development at a prestigious academy to the very summit of European club football. But Inter, in the mid-1990s, was a complicated environment, a club with enormous resources and expectations, and a rotation of high-profile players that made it difficult for any individual to establish the kind of consistent identity that his playing style required. He found it difficult at Inter, not because his ability had changed, but because the system and the environment did not create the conditions in which his particular gifts could express themselves most clearly. He needed trust, the kind of trust that allows a player to make decisions that look wrong in the short term and prove themselves right in the slightly longer term. Inter's context, with its pressure and its impatience, did not consistently provide that. The period at Inter produced moments of quality, glimpses of what he was capable of in the right conditions, but not the sustained platform that would allow his true character as a player to become visible. He moved in and out of the team, played with different partners, operated in different tactical configurations. The club was not wrong to have wanted him. He was not wrong to have gone. The match between player and environment simply did not produce what both parties had hoped for. Before the move to Inter had fully resolved itself, something happened that belongs to a different register from club football entirely. The 1996 Atlanta Olympics arrived, and Nigeria's national football team arrived at that tournament as a side that almost no one outside the country expected to achieve anything significant. The context of the 1996 Olympic football tournament is worth understanding clearly. This was the competition's first edition, after FIFA had expanded the eligibility rules to allow players over 23, with each squad permitted to include a small number of players above that age threshold. The result was a tournament that contained some of the best young talent in the world, alongside more experienced contributors. It was taken seriously by the nations that entered it seriously. Nigeria entered it seriously. The squad contained Kanu and other players who were either already established at European clubs or on the verge of becoming so. But Nigeria as a football nation was not treated by the tournament's broader narrative as a genuine threat to the established powers. Brazil were there. Argentina were there. European nations of considerable pedigree were present. Nigeria were interesting, perhaps, capable of surprising one or two opponents, but not the sort of side that serious analysts would identify as candidates for the final. There is a particular atmosphere that gathers around a team that no one expects. It is not the atmosphere of pressure, which belongs to the favourites, the sides who are watched closely from the beginning and assessed continuously against their own stated ambitions. It is something lighter, and in some ways more free. The opponents prepare for you, but not with the same depth of preparation they would bring to a match against Brazil or Argentina. The media attention is present, but not suffocating. There is space, within that relative freedom from expectation, to simply play. Nigeria, in that space, played well. The group stage passed with results that confirmed they were capable, without quite advertising the scale of what was coming. Each match contained its own internal logic, its own moments of difficulty and resolution, and the team moved through them with a composure that was not immediately legible to outside observers, as the composure of a side that was about to do something historically significant. The tournament unfolded in a way that serious analysts had not predicted. Nigeria progressed through the group stage, and then through the knockout rounds, in a way that required opponents to adjust their expectations, match by match. In the semi-final, they faced Brazil. Brazil in 1996 was a side with genuine quality, with players who would go on to significant careers in the European game, and Nigeria were not given much chance. The match was tight, competitive, the kind of game where either result would have been defensible. Nigeria won. Before the final, there would have been a quality of silence in the Nigeria camp that is difficult to reconstruct from the outside. They had beaten Brazil. They were in the Olympic final. These were facts that had not existed before, facts that the players were now required to carry into a match against Argentina. The expectation of the neutral observer had already been exceeded. What remained was the final itself, and the particular freedom and weight that comes with having nothing left to lose and everything still to play for. The final was against Argentina. Argentina, similarly, carried the weight of expectation that attaches to one of the sport's great nations. And similarly, they were considered the more likely winners of the two sides who had reached the final. The match was played in Athens, Georgia, and it was close in the way that finals tend to be close, with neither side dominating, and the margin, when it came, being small. Nigeria won the gold medal. The result was received in Nigeria with an intensity that reflected what it meant for a nation whose relationship with football had always contained aspiration, but rarely found this particular kind of fulfillment. Olympic gold in football was not something Nigeria had held before. It was not something that had seemed proximate or likely until it happened. And then it happened. And the players who had made it happen were understood at home in a way that their club careers in Europe, however impressive, could never quite replicate. Kanu was part of this. Not the sole architect, not the singular hero of a narrative that reduces complex team achievement to one individual's contribution, but something more than a peripheral presence too. There are teams that win because of their energy, or their organization, or their willingness to suffer together. This Nigerian side had those things, but it also had, near the center of its functioning, a player whose calm made the chaos legible, whose stillness gave the others around him a point of reference. A heart, in the quiet sense of the word, not the loudest part, but the part that keeps everything moving. Someone whose particular combination of qualities, the timing, the control, the ability to find solutions in tight spaces, was part of what made this side function as well as it did. Back in Europe, the career continued its search for the right environment. The move to Arsenal in 1999 was the thing that finally provided it. Arsenal under Arsene Wenger was a specific kind of project. Wenger had arrived at the club in 1996 and had begun the slow transformation of a team that had been successful in a particular way: physically strong, tactically disciplined, organized around defensive solidity and set-piece efficiency, into something different. He wanted players who could think, who could control the ball, who could maintain possession under pressure, and find solutions in the final third through intelligence rather than force. He was building, with patience and with a clear aesthetic vision, a team whose football would be pleasurable to watch and difficult to play against. Kanu arrived into this environment from Inter, where things had not fully worked, and found something different. What Arsenal provided was not simply a different tactical system, though the system mattered. It was a different quality of trust. Wenger trusted players who made unconventional decisions, who saw things differently, who were willing to attempt something that looked risky because the underlying logic was sound. This was exactly the kind of trust that Kanu's playing style required. There is a moment in the settling into a new club that is rarely discussed and never filmed. It is the moment, somewhere in the first weeks of training, when a player begins to feel that the people around him understand how he plays. Not just accept it, but understand it. When a pass arrives at the right moment, because the player who played it has started to predict where you will be. When a run you make is tracked by a teammate who has begun to learn your particular language of movement. For Kanu, at Arsenal, this moment came. And when it came, what was already present in him began to have room to express itself more fully. His style, as it had always been, was built around timing rather than speed. He moved across the pitch with strides that seemed deceptively casual, that covered ground without appearing to do so. Defenders who tried to read his movement found it difficult to anticipate because it did not follow the expected templates. Most forwards accelerate into space. Most forwards impose their pace on the situation, creating the conditions for a chance through sudden movement. Kanu did something different. He waited. He occupied positions. He understood where space was going to exist before it existed, and he placed himself at the edge of that space, still, until the moment when the ball arrived and the space opened. And the action that followed seemed, in retrospect, inevitable. To watch him from the stands at Highbury during those years was to experience a particular kind of confusion that eventually resolved itself into understanding. A defender would be tracking him, maintaining proximity, doing everything that the defensive task required. And then, without any obvious acceleration or directional change that the eye could clearly follow, Kanu would be somewhere slightly different. The defender would adjust, and then slightly different again. The movement was not dramatic. It was incremental, almost conversational, a series of small adjustments that accumulated into a meaningful positional shift before the defender had registered that a meaningful positional shift had occurred. The body that had once seemed like a disadvantage, too tall, too slender, oddly proportioned for the athleticism that football required, had become the instrument through which something specific and unusual was expressed. His long limbs gave him a reach that defenders found difficult to account for. The ball that seemed to be going past him was not going past him. The touch that seemed too heavy was not too heavy. The angle that seemed impossible was not impossible, because the length of his leg and the flexibility of his control allowed him to manipulate the ball from positions that a more conventionally proportioned striker could not reach. He had extraordinary close control for a player of his size. Close control is usually associated with smaller, lower to the ground players who can use their proximity to the ball to shield it and manipulate it quickly. Kanu, who was over 6 feet tall, maintained a relationship with the ball that was more like what you would associate with a player 8 inches shorter. He could receive the ball while facing away from goal, with the defender close behind him, and find a way to spin or turn or simply shift his weight in a direction that created a yard of space where no yard had existed. This was not strength, exactly. It was balance and timing, and a kind of spatial deception that operated at the level of individual muscle movements, rather than large-scale positional shifts. Defenders who played against him regularly spoke about a particular kind of disorientation. Not the disorientation that comes from facing a player who is faster than you can handle, where the experience is essentially of watching someone disappear in the direction of goal before you can respond. This was different. It was the disorientation of having planned for what you thought was happening and finding, almost without understanding when the moment of error occurred, that you had planned for the wrong thing. He had been in one place and was now in another, and the movement between those two states had been so quiet, so lacking in the usual signals that defenders rely on to read intention, that you had simply missed it. One defender, asked afterward about the specific difficulty of marking him, described the experience as trying to track a conversation rather than a movement. You would follow the words, understand each one, and then realize that the meaning had arrived somewhere you had not anticipated. There was no single moment of failure. There was simply a conclusion that you had not seen forming. This quality of movement made him genuinely difficult to coach against, in the sense that the instructions a manager who could give a defender before a match involving Kanu were limited in their usefulness. You could not say, watch for the burst of pace, because there was no burst of pace. You could not say, he will cut inside, because he might, or he might not. And the tell that would normally allow you to predict which was absent or misleading. What defenders who faced him most effectively tended to do was try to deny him the ball entirely, to prevent him from ever receiving possession in the positions he favoured, because once he had the ball in those positions, the options for dealing with the situation collapsed very quickly. At Arsenal, he played in a team that could also hurt opponents in many other ways. Thierry Henry was there, and Henry was a forward of a completely different kind, explosive, direct, a player who imposed pace on situations and whose finishing had a spectacular quality that Kanu's did not. The coexistence of these two different forward types was not accidental. Wenger understood that variety in attacking patterns creates problems for defences that cannot be solved by a single approach. A defence that organised itself to handle Henry's directness left spaces that Kanu could exploit. A defence that adjusted to handle Kanu's unpredictability created different openings that Henry could find. Within the dressing room at Arsenal, the respect for Kanu was of a particular kind. He was not the most vocal presence. He was not the kind of personality who organises social events or leads conversations in team meetings with the authority of someone who has appointed himself the group's voice. He was quieter than that, present without imposing. The kind of person whose influence operates through consistency and through the quality of what they do when they are asked to do it. His teammates spoke about him with a warmth that went beyond the usual professional respect. There was an affection in it that suggested something about the particular pleasure of sharing a working environment with someone who makes the collective effort better in ways that are not always easy to measure. His time at Arsenal included an FA Cup victory, a competition that carries a specific weight in English football, a weight that is different from the Premier League's and not reducible to it. Cup competitions have their own emotional logic, their own capacity to contain defining moments, and winning the cup meant something at a club whose history included significant FA Cup achievements. There was also, during his Arsenal period, the matter of a specific match against Chelsea in September 1999 that has become one of the more discussed individual contributions of his career. In that match, he came off the bench with Arsenal losing and produced a performance, including 2 late goals, that changed the result completely and in a way that had a particular character, quietly astonishing, the kind of contribution that seems impossible as it happens and entirely logical in retrospect. This was the Kanu pattern expressed at its most vivid, arriving at the moment when it mattered, doing the improbable thing in the manner that looked, on reflection, inevitable. He spent several seasons at Arsenal before moving to West Bromwich Albion, and then to Portsmouth, a South Coast club that during the mid-2000s had a period of genuine competitive quality. Portsmouth won the FA Cup in 2008, and Kanu was part of that squad. He was 31 by then, no longer in the full productivity of his prime years, but still a presence of genuine value. A player whose understanding of the game had accumulated to a depth that allowed him to contribute meaningfully, even as the purely physical elements of performance continued their gradual transition. A player of 31 who has experienced what Kanu had experienced carries a different kind of knowledge into a dressing room from the knowledge that younger players carry. The heart surgery at 20, the recovery, the years of navigating different clubs and different systems, the Olympic gold, the various domestic honours, all of this had accumulated into a form of understanding that was not simply tactical or technical, but something closer to wisdom about the game and about what sustains a person through the demands of a professional career over many years. At Portsmouth, younger players would have observed him in training and noticed things that took time to understand. The way he did not hurry when hurrying was not necessary. The way he chose his moments of intensity with a precision that conserved energy without reducing effectiveness. The way he communicated on the pitch with an economy of gesture and word that suggested deep familiarity with what the game required, rather than the anxious over-communication of someone trying to demonstrate engagement. These are things that cannot be coached in the conventional sense. They are absorbed over time, from proximity to someone who has learned them through experience. The FA Cup winners' medal at Portsmouth was the kind of achievement that comes at the end of a long career's middle stage, when the titles and the major tournament victories have been collected, and what remains is the possibility of contribution in a different register. He was a veteran presence in a squad that contained younger players, and his role was partly the formal one of playing when selected, and partly the less formal one of simply being who he was in an environment where younger players could observe what sustained professional excellence at a high level actually looked like day to day. His later career took him to other clubs, back to Nigeria for a period, to further destinations that represented the gradual winding down of a career at the very highest level. Each move extended the career, allowed the game to continue being played, but at progressively lower levels of intensity. This is the arc that almost all professional footballers follow, and Kanu followed it without drama, without the kind of public difficulty that some very talented players experience, when the exceptional becomes merely good. The physical legacy of his heart condition, the surgery, the recovery, the decades of professional football conducted in a body that had been opened and repaired, settled into his life after the playing years, in ways that were not always publicly visible. He was someone who understood the relationship between his body and his career at a level of intimacy that most players do not reach, because he had been forced to confront the vulnerability of the physical instrument at an age when most young athletes assume their bodies are essentially invulnerable. This understanding had perhaps always been present in the way he played, in the economy of movement, in the absence of recklessness, in the sense that he was always taking care of something precious while simultaneously asking it to perform. After football, the portion of his life that has attracted the most consistent attention is his humanitarian work. He founded the Kanu Heart Foundation, an organization specifically focused on addressing the problem of heart conditions in children in Nigeria and other African countries who lack the access to the medical resources that can identify and treat those conditions. The foundation has funded surgeries, has facilitated treatment, has worked to create some of the infrastructure that allows the detection and repair of cardiac problems in populations where such infrastructure is not otherwise available. The connection between his personal history and this work is direct and visible. He had a heart condition that was identified because he was in Europe, at a major football club, with access to the medical examination protocols that apply to professional athletes at that level. The condition was found and treated. The career continued. Had he been a child in Nigeria, without access to professional football's medical structures, the condition might not have been found until it was more dangerous. He understood this clearly, and acted on the understanding in a way that was not performative or institutional in an empty sense, but genuinely engaged with the specific problem he was positioned to address. This post-football chapter is less dramatic in the narrative sense than the Champions League victory, or the Olympic gold medal, or the Chelsea match. It does not have the concentrated intensity of sporting achievement, but it has a different kind of weight, the weight of someone using the position that football had given them to address a problem that they understood from the inside. The work continues. The respect that exists for Kanu across continents is of a particular kind, one that does not reduce to a single type of achievement. In Nigeria, he is understood as someone who brought the country to the attention of the world through football, and then used that attention in service of something beyond football. Among football people in England, among those who watched him at Arsenal and at Portsmouth, he is remembered with the warmth that attaches to players who were genuinely unusual, who made watching football feel slightly different from how it normally feels. Among coaches and tactical thinkers who study the game, he represents a specific type of forward intelligence that is discussed in the same breath as the broader conversation about how different physical and mental configurations can produce excellence in different forms. The question of why he always looked different does not have a simple answer. And perhaps the absence of a simple answer is the most honest thing that can be said about it. He was tall in a way that athletic templates did not expect to be graceful. He was slow in a way that the game's conventional logic did not expect to be effective. He was precise in a way that his physical appearance did not immediately suggest. All of these apparent contradictions were not contradictions at all, because they were all expressions of the same underlying quality, a relationship between mind and body and ball that was organized differently from the way most players were organized, and that produced effects that most players could not produce. He did not fit the template, and the template did not change to accommodate him. He simply played the game in the way that he played it, from the streets of Owerri to the Ajax Academy, to the Champions League final, to the Olympic gold, to the Emirates Stadium, and beyond. And what the game produced in response to his particular way of being in it was a career that no standard model would have predicted. There were defenders who, years after they had finished their careers, were asked about the opponents who had caused them the most difficulty, and who mentioned him. Not with the particular frustration that very fast opponents generate, the kind of helplessness that comes from facing someone who simply operates above the speed that you can handle. The difficulty he created was more particular than that. It was the difficulty of facing someone who made you feel that you had understood the situation and then revealed, gently and without apparent effort, that you had not. The space you thought was closed was open. The ball you thought was going away from him was at his feet. The moment you thought had passed had not passed. This quality, The quiet revelation that your understanding was incomplete was perhaps the most accurate description of what made him different. He did not overwhelm defenders. He did not outrun them. He simply showed them, at the critical moment, that the picture they had formed of the situation contained an error. And by the time they had registered the error, the moment had already moved on to its conclusion. What this required was not speed, not power, not the conventional athletic qualities that scouting systems are designed to measure. What it required was understanding, a depth of comprehension of the game's geometry, of the way possession and movement and pressure interact in the space of a football pitch, that allowed him to see what was going to happen slightly before it happened, and to place himself in the right relationship to it. He never seemed to impose anything on the game. He never seemed to be forcing it toward an outcome through the application of physical will. He seemed instead to be participating in something that was already unfolding, reading its direction and moving with it, finding the position that the game's own logic was creating and occupying it before anyone else had noticed it was there. This is not a description of passivity. It is a description of a very active and demanding form of attention. The stillness before his touch was not the stillness of someone who was not engaged. It was the stillness of someone who was completely engaged, who had processed the situation so thoroughly that the movement, when it came, required no additional thinking, only execution. The ball arrives. The touch takes it. The space opens. The goalkeeper is already moving in the wrong direction, or the pass is already arriving at the teammate in the position that the defender has just vacated. And Kanu is already standing somewhere else, slightly apart from the celebration, looking at the next situation beginning to form. He did not rush the game. He watched it, understood it, moved inside it at the pace it required, rather than the pace that excitement or anxiety might have imposed. The game unfolded around him, and he was always already where it was going. The movement slows. The space opens. And what remains is not speed, but understanding. A generation defined itself through that Atlanta summer, and he was at the center of it, not because he demanded the space, but because the game, in its quiet way, kept placing him there. The heart does not announce itself. It simply continues. Good night.